Michael Chen had been looking forward to this trip for months. At 34 years old, he'd been working non-stop at his software engineering job in Seattle, pulling late nights and weekend shifts to meet deadlines. His boss finally convinced him to take some time off, and Michael decided on Miami. Sunshine, beaches, and absolutely no laptops. That was the plan. The airport was packed that Tuesday morning. Michael grabbed his boarding pass, made it through security, and found himself at gate 23 with 40 minutes to spare. He bought an overpriced coffee and a magazine he'd never read, then settled into one of those uncomfortable airport chairs that seemed designed to prevent anyone from getting too comfortable. When boarding finally started, Michael shuffled down the narrow aisle of Flight 447, searching for seat 14A. The plane was one of those mid-sized aircrafts, nothing fancy but clean enough. He squeezed past a businessman already snoring in the aisle seat and claimed his window spot. As he shoved his carry-on into the overhead compartment, he heard someone struggling behind him. An elderly woman, probably in her mid-70s, was trying to lift her bag above her head. She was tiny, maybe 5 feet tall, and the bag looked like it weighed almost as much as she did. Two younger passengers brushed past her without a second glance, too absorbed in their phones to notice. Michael stepped back into the aisle. "Here, let me help you with that." The woman looked up at him with relieved eyes. "Oh, thank you so much, dear. I don't know why I pack so heavy. My son always tells me I bring too much." Michael lifted the bag easily and slid it into the compartment above her seat, which was directly across the aisle from his. "No problem at all. Better safe than sorry, right?" She smiled at him, and something about that smile struck Michael. It was warm and genuine, the kind of smile his grandmother used to give him before she passed away. His grandmother had died when he was 12, in a house fire that still haunted him. He'd been staying at a friend's house that night, safe and unaware while she was trapped inside. The guilt had never fully left him. "You're very kind," the woman said, settling into her seat. "My name is Eleanor Hartwell." "Michael Chen. Nice to meet you." They exchanged a few more pleasantries before Michael returned to his seat. Eleanor pulled out a book, one of those thick paperback novels with a sunset on the cover. Michael noticed her hands shook slightly as she opened it. She caught him looking and smiled apologetically. "Getting older isn't for the faint of heart," she said with a small laugh. Michael smiled back but felt a pang of concern. She seemed frail, vulnerable in a way that reminded him too much of his grandmother in her final years. The plane filled up quickly, families with restless children, business travelers typing away on laptops, a group of college students clearly heading somewhere for spring break. The usual mix. A flight attendant with perfectly styled hair went through the safety demonstration that everyone ignored, and then the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. "Good morning, folks. This is Captain Rodriguez. We're all set for departure. Weather looks good, and we should have you in Miami in just under 5 hours. Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight." The engines roared to life, and Michael felt that familiar pressure as the plane accelerated down the runway. He wasn't afraid of flying exactly, but he never felt completely relaxed until the plane was safely on the ground again. He watched through the window as Seattle grew smaller below them, the city giving way to forests and mountains. 20 minutes into the flight, Michael had just started to doze off when he heard it. A sound like a firecracker, sharp and sudden. His eyes snapped open. Other passengers were looking around too, confused and concerned. Then came the screaming. Black smoke was pouring out from the back of the plane, billowing forward like some kind of dark wave. The smell hit Michael immediately, that acrid chemical smell of burning plastic and wiring. People started shouting. A flight attendant rushed past, her face pale, her earlier composure completely gone. "Everyone stay calm," another attendant yelled, but her voice was drowned out by the rising panic. The plane lurched violently and Michael grabbed his armrests. The oxygen masks dropped from above, swinging like bizarre yellow pendulums. He fumbled with his own mask, his hands shaking as he tried to remember the instructions he'd ignored 1,000 times before. "Pull down firmly. Place over nose and mouth. Breathe normally." How do you breathe normally when you're convinced you're about to die? The captain's voice came back on, tighter now, stripped of its earlier confidence. "This is Captain Rodriguez. We have a fire in the rear galley. I'm initiating an emergency descent. Flight attendants, prepare for emergency landing." Emergency landing. Those words sent a fresh wave of terror through the cabin. Michael could see the smoke getting thicker, could feel the heat starting to build. Through the chaos, he saw a flight attendant with a fire extinguisher disappearing into the smoke, trying to fight back the flames. It didn't seem to be working. People were crying now, some praying out loud, others frantically texting on their phones trying to send what might be final messages to loved ones. The college students who'd been laughing and joking earlier were holding each other, their faces streaked with tears. A little girl across the aisle was screaming for her mother. Michael looked over at Eleanor. She hadn't moved. While everyone else was panicking, putting on their oxygen masks, preparing for the worst, she was just sitting there perfectly still. Her book had fallen to the floor. Her hands were clutched to her chest and her face had gone gray. Ma'am, are you okay? Michael called across the aisle, but she didn't respond. The plane was descending fast now, too fast. Michael could feel the pressure in his ears, could see the ground getting closer through the window. They had maybe 10 minutes, maybe less. The fire was growing, consuming the back of the plane. He could hear it now, that horrible roaring sound that fire makes when it's really going. Flight attendants were moving through the aisles, helping people, checking seatbelts, preparing for impact. One of them reached Eleanor's row and tried to help her with her oxygen mask. But Eleanor seemed completely unresponsive. In some kind of shock, the plane shook again, harder this time, and Michael heard a terrible cracking sound from somewhere above. He looked up just in time to see one of the overhead compartments starting to come loose, right above Eleanor's head. The heat from the fire was apparently weakening the structure of the cabin. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. The compartment door swung open, luggage starting to tumble out. Eleanor was directly beneath it, still frozen, still clutching her chest, completely unaware of the danger. Other passengers were too focused on their own survival to notice. Michael didn't think. He just moved. He unbuckled his seatbelt and lunged across the aisle, grabbing Eleanor's arm and pulling her toward him just as a heavy suitcase crashed down exactly where her head had been. The impact was so hard it cracked the armrest of her seat. Eleanor gasped, suddenly coming back to awareness. She looked at Michael, then at the destroyed seat beside her, and her eyes widened in understanding. "We need to move," Michael said, his voice rough through the oxygen mask. "Can you stand?" But even as he asked, he could see she couldn't. Whatever had seized her, whether it was a panic attack or something worse, had left her weak and disoriented. The smoke was getting thicker. The heat was becoming unbearable, and they were running out of time. The plane was falling out of the sky, and Michael knew they had minutes at best. Through the thickening smoke, he could see other passengers streaming toward the emergency exits at the front of the plane. Everyone was pushing, shoving, desperate to get out. The basic instinct to survive had kicked in, and people weren't thinking about anyone but themselves and their loved ones. Michael looked down at Eleanor. Her breathing was shallow and rapid. Her skin had that grayish color that scared him more than the fire itself. He'd seen that color before on his grandmother's face in the months before she died. "Ma'am, I need you to work with me here," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady, even though his heart was hammering in his chest. "We're going to get out of this, but I need your help." Eleanor's eyes focused on him for a moment. "Leave me," she whispered, her voice so quiet he almost didn't hear it over the screaming and the roar of the fire. "You don't even know me. Save yourself." Those words hit Michael like a physical blow. He'd heard similar words before in his nightmares about his grandmother. What if she'd said something like that to the firefighters? What if she'd thought she wasn't worth saving? The guilt he'd carried for 22 years suddenly transformed into something else. Determination. "Not happening," Michael said firmly. He unbuckled Eleanor's seatbelt and tried to help her stand, but her legs wouldn't support her weight. She started to collapse, and he caught her, feeling how light she was, how fragile. It reminded him of holding his grandmother when she'd gotten sick, before the fire, when she could barely walk from the bedroom to the bathroom. The heat was intense now. Michael could feel it on his face, could see the orange glow of flames through the smoke. Another overhead compartment crashed open, spilling bags and belongings into the aisle. A laptop hit the floor and shattered. Someone's phone skittered past his feet. Michael made a decision. He pulled off Eleanor's oxygen mask, so at his own, stuffed them into his pocket, then hoisted the elderly woman onto his back in a fireman's carry. She weighed maybe 100 pounds, but in that moment, with the smoke burning his lungs and the plane shaking beneath them, she felt impossibly heavy. "Hold on to me," he told her, and he felt her thin arms weakly wrap around his shoulders. He started moving toward the front of the plane, where he could see the emergency exits and the blessed sight of daylight. But the aisle was chaos. Luggage had fallen everywhere, creating obstacles. The smoke was so thick he could barely see 3 feet in front of him. His eyes were streaming, tears mixing with the sweat pouring down his face. A man in a business suit pushed past him roughly, nearly knocking them both down. Michael stumbled but caught himself against a seat. He kept moving, one step then another. His lungs were burning. Every breath felt like inhaling broken glass. "Almost there," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was saying it to Eleanor or himself. Just a little further. But the smoke was getting worse, not better. Michael realized with horror that he was disoriented. He couldn't tell if he was moving toward the front of the plane or accidentally going deeper into the fire. The cabin had become a nightmare maze of smoke and shadows. He stopped trying to get his bearings. His vision was starting to blur. He could feel Eleanor's weight on his back, could feel her labored breathing against his neck. If he made the wrong choice now, they would both die. Then through the smoke he saw a figure. A flight attendant, her uniform torn and covered in soot, was waving frantically. She had a flashlight cutting through the darkness like a beacon. "This way," she screamed. "Follow my voice!" Michael pushed forward, following that light. His legs felt like rubber. He stumbled over something, he didn't know what, and nearly went down. The flight attendant was suddenly there, grabbing his arm, helping to support him. "I've got you," she said. Just a few more steps. Together they made it to the emergency exit. The door had already been opened, the evacuation slide deployed. Michael could see people at the bottom, could see fire trucks and ambulances racing toward the plane. He'd never seen anything more beautiful. "You first," the flight attendant said, trying to take Eleanor from his back. "I'll help her down." But Michael shook his head. He didn't trust anyone else now. He'd come this far, and he was going to see this through. Still carrying Eleanor, he sat at the edge of the door. "Hold tight," he told her, and then they were sliding. The inflatable slide was steep and fast. Michael tried to control their descent, but they hit the bottom hard. He rolled as they landed, trying to protect Eleanor from the impact. They tumbled onto the tarmac, and Michael felt the blessed relief of solid ground beneath him. Hands were grabbing them immediately. Paramedics, firefighters, airport personnel. Someone pulled Eleanor away from him, laying her on a stretcher. Someone else was putting an oxygen mask on his face, asking him questions he couldn't quite process. "The woman," Michael managed to say. "Is she okay?" "We've got her, sir." "You did good. Just breathe now." Michael let himself collapse onto his back, staring up at the sky. It was blue and clear and perfect. His lungs were screaming, and he could feel burns on his arms where he must have brushed against something hot. But he was alive. They were alive. He turned his head and saw Eleanor on a stretcher a few feet away. Paramedics were working on her, checking her vitals, putting in an IV. She was conscious, though, and as if she could feel him looking at her, she turned her head toward him. Their eyes met across the chaos. She was crying. He was too, he realized. Not from pain or fear anymore, but from something else. Relief. Gratitude. The overwhelming sense that something important had just happened, though he couldn't fully understand what. Around them, the scene was controlled chaos. Passengers were scattered across the tarmac, some sitting on the ground in shock, others being treated by medical personnel. The plane was still burning, thick black smoke pouring into the sky. Firefighters were spraying it with foam, trying to contain the blaze before it reached the fuel tanks. Michael saw the flight attendant who'd helped him, sitting on the ground with her own oxygen mask. She caught his eye and gave him a thumbs up. He returned the gesture weakly. "Sir, we need to take you to the hospital," a paramedic was saying. "You've got smoke inhalation and some burns." "Can you tell me your name?" "Michael," he said. "Michael Chen." "Okay, Michael. You're going to be fine." "Can you sit up for me?" They helped him onto a stretcher. As they were loading him into an ambulance, Michael saw them loading Eleanor into another one. He wanted to call out to her, to ask if she was really okay, but his voice wouldn't work properly. The paramedics were putting something over his face, oxygen mixed with something else, something that made the world start to feel soft and distant. The last thing he saw before the ambulance doors closed was Eleanor being loaded into her own ambulance, still alive, still breathing. He'd done it. He'd saved her. Unlike his grandmother, unlike all those years of guilt and nightmares, this time he'd been able to do something. The ambulance lurched forward, sirens wailing. Michael closed his eyes and let the exhaustion wash over him. His body hurt everywhere. His lungs felt like they'd been scraped raw from the inside, but none of that mattered. He'd saved a life. He'd made a difference. In the other ambulance, Eleanor was thinking the same thing about him. This young man who didn't know her, who had no reason to risk his life for her, had carried her through fire. As the paramedics worked on her, checking her heart rate and blood pressure, she kept thinking about his face, about the determination in his eyes when he'd refused to leave her behind. She thought about telling him the truth. She should have told him on the plane before all this happened. But she'd been too scared, and then there was no time. Now lying in this ambulance, her body weak and her heart racing, Eleanor knew she couldn't keep the secret any longer. This young man had saved her life. He deserved to know that 34 years ago she'd saved his, but that conversation would have to wait. First, they both needed to survive the next few hours. They needed to heal. And then, when the time was right, Eleanor would tell Michael Chen the truth about the night he was born, and the nurse who refused to let him die. She just hoped he would believe her. Michael's eyes opened slowly, fighting against the heaviness of medication and exhaustion. The first thing he noticed was the beeping, steady rhythmic electronic heart monitor his foggy brain registered. The second thing he noticed was that everything hurt, but in that distant way that suggested serious painkillers were involved. He was in a hospital room. The blinds were partially closed, letting in weak afternoon light. How long had he been asleep? The last thing he clearly remembered was the ambulance, the sirens, someone telling him to stay awake while simultaneously injecting something into his arm that made staying awake feel impossible. "You're awake. That's good." A nurse appeared beside his bed, checking the monitors. She was middle-aged with kind eyes and tired smile. "How are you feeling, Mr. Chen?" "Like I got hit by a truck," Michael managed, his voice coming out rough and scratchy. His throat felt like sandpaper. "That's the smoke inhalation. Your lungs took quite a beating, but you're going to be fine. The doctor will be in soon to explain everything. But the short version is you've got some second-degree burns on your arms and significant smoke damage to your respiratory system. You're lucky you're young and healthy. Another few minutes in that smoke, though." She trailed off, shaking her head. Michael tried to sit up, and the nurse gently but firmly pushed him back down. "Easy, you've been out for 3 days. Your body needs rest." 3 days? Michael's mind reeled. The woman. The older woman on the plane. Eleanor Hartwell. "Is she—" The nurse's expression softened. "She's fine. Better than fine, actually, thanks to you. You're something of a hero, Mr. Chen. It's all over the news." News? Michael felt like he was missing pieces of a puzzle. The nurse pulled out her phone and showed him. His own face stared back at him from a news article headline. "Software engineer risks life to save elderly woman in plane fire." There was a grainy video, apparently shot by another passenger, showing Michael carrying Eleanor through the smoke. He looked like some kind of action movie character, except scared and desperate instead of cool and confident. "The video's been viewed millions of times," the nurse said. "You've got reporters calling the hospital every hour wanting interviews. Your family's been here, by the way. Your parents flew in from Seattle the day after the crash. They've been here every day. We sent them to get some rest about 2 hours ago." Michael's head was spinning. Hero. Reporters. Millions of views. None of that felt real. He'd just done what anyone should do. He couldn't leave someone to die, especially not someone who reminded him so much of his grandmother. Over the next 24 hours, Michael learned the full story of what had happened. The plane had experienced an electrical fire that spread faster than anyone could have predicted. All 147 passengers and 6 crew members had survived, though many had injuries. 3 people were in critical condition, but everyone was expected to recover. The pilot and co-pilot were being called heroes for managing the emergency landing. Michael was being called a hero for saving Eleanor. His parents visited that evening, and his mother cried when she hugged him, careful to avoid his bandaged arms. His father, normally stoic and reserved, had tears in his eyes. "When we heard about the plane," his mother said, "when we saw your name on the passenger list before we knew everyone survived, I thought we'd lost you." "I'm okay, Mom, really." "You risked your life for a stranger," his father said quietly. "We're so proud of you." Michael felt uncomfortable with the praise. He kept thinking about all the other passengers who'd pushed past Eleanor, who'd ignored her in their own panic. He'd almost been one of them. If he hadn't looked over at that exact moment, if he hadn't seen her sitting there frozen, on his 4th day in the hospital, Michael was sitting up in bed eating terrible hospital food and watching mindless television, when there was a knock on his door. "Come in," he called, expecting another nurse or maybe a doctor. The door opened and Eleanor Hartwell came in, pushed in a wheelchair by a man in his 50s wearing an expensive suit. Eleanor looked dramatically better than the last time Michael had seen her. Her color had returned, and though she still looked fragile, there was life in her eyes now. "Michael," she said, and her voice cracked with emotion. "Mrs. Hartwell, I'm so glad you're okay." The man wheeling her moved her closer to Michael's bed, then stepped back. Eleanor reached out with a shaking hand and Michael took it gently. Her skin was paper thin, spotted with age, but her grip was surprisingly strong. "I need to thank you," she started, but Michael shook his head. "You don't have to thank me. I'm just glad we both made it out." "No, you don't understand. I need to thank you, and I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you on the plane, but I was too much of a coward." Tears were forming in her eyes now. "I almost died without telling you, and that would have been wrong. You deserve to know." Michael felt a strange flutter in his chest. "Know what?" Eleanor took a deep breath and the man behind her put a supportive hand on her shoulder. "This is my son, Richard," she said. "He's a doctor. I asked him to bring something with me today." Richard stepped forward and handed Michael a folder. Michael opened it, confused. Inside were medical records yellowed with age. He saw his own name at the top of one page, Baby Boy Chen, date of birth December 14th, 1990, location, Seattle Grace Hospital. "I don't understand," Michael said, looking up at Eleanor. 40 years ago, Eleanor said, her voice trembling. "I was a nurse at Seattle Grace Hospital. I worked in the maternity ward. It was a good job, but it was hard. Some nights were harder than others." She paused, gathering herself. Michael waited, his heart starting to beat faster. December 14th, 1990 was one of those hard nights. A young couple brought in their 3-week-old baby boy. He'd stopped breathing. SIDS, we thought at first. Sudden infant death syndrome. It's every parent's worst nightmare. Michael's hands were shaking now. December 14th, 1990, his birthday. His parents had told him once about how he'd stopped breathing as a baby, about how the hospital had saved him, but they'd never gone into detail. The other nurses were ready to call it, Eleanor continued, tears flowing freely now. "But I couldn't let that baby die. He was so small, so perfect. I performed CPR for 8 minutes straight. My arms were burning, my back was screaming, but I kept going. And on the 8th minute, his heart started beating again. He took a breath. He lived." Michael couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too hot. "That baby's name was Michael Chen," Eleanor said. "I saved your life 34 years ago when you were just 3 weeks old. And last week you saved mine." The folder slipped from Michael's hands. Papers scattered across the hospital bed. He stared at Eleanor, his mind refusing to process what she'd just told him. It was impossible. It was too much of a coincidence. Things like this didn't happen in real life. "I have the records," Richard said gently, gathering the papers. "Hospital records, my mother's nursing logs from that night. It's all documented. After the plane crash made the news and we saw your name and age, I pulled the files. It's really you. The same Michael Chen my mother saved all those years ago." Michael looked at the papers, then at Eleanor, then back at the papers. His parents had mentioned the incident when he was younger. They'd called it a miracle. The doctors had said he was dead, they'd told him. But one nurse refused to give up. She'd brought him back. "You," Michael whispered. "It was you." Eleanor nodded, crying openly now. "I never knew what happened to you after that night." Nurses don't usually follow up with patients, especially not for decades. "But I remembered you. I remembered your parents, how your mother sobbed when you started breathing again. I remembered thinking that I'd done something that mattered. Why didn't you tell me?" Michael asked. "On the plane before everything happened?" Eleanor's face crumpled. "I was scared. I saw you help me with my bag and I thought you looked familiar, but I wasn't sure. Then I saw your name on your boarding pass when you sat down and I knew. Michael Chen from Seattle. The same age my baby would be now. But how do you start that conversation? 'Excuse me, young man, but I think I saved your life when you were a baby.' It sounds crazy." "Then the fire started," Richard added, "and there was no time for anything except survival." Michael felt like his entire understanding of the world had just shifted. He'd spent 22 years carrying guilt about his grandmother, feeling like he'd failed to save someone who needed him. He'd gotten on that plane by random chance, sat across from Eleanor by random chance, and then when she needed help, he'd been there. "This isn't random," Michael said slowly. "This can't be random." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I don't know if it's fate or God or just impossible coincidence, but I know that 40 years ago I gave you a chance at life, and last week you gave me a chance to keep living mine. Whatever it is, Michael, we're connected now. We always have been, we just didn't know it." The news spread like wildfire. What had been a remarkable rescue story became something else entirely when the connection between Michael and Eleanor came to light. The media couldn't get enough of it. Major networks picked up the story. Morning shows called it divine intervention. Social media exploded with theories about fate and destiny. Michael's hospital room became a circus. His phone, once he finally got it back from the airline's recovered belongings, had hundreds of missed calls and thousands of messages. His email inbox was overflowing. News outlets from around the world wanted interviews. Movie producers were calling about adaptation rights. It was overwhelming. But all Michael cared about was understanding what had really happened that night in 1990. 3 days after Eleanor's revelation, when both of them were feeling stronger, Richard arranged for Michael's parents to visit while Eleanor was there. Michael had called them the night before, telling them what he'd learned, and his mother had broken down on the phone. When they walked into his hospital room and saw Eleanor sitting there, his mother stopped in her tracks. Her hand went to her mouth and tears immediately started streaming down her face. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I remember you." Eleanor stood up from her wheelchair, shaky but determined. Michael's mother rushed forward and the two women embraced, both sobbing. Michael's father stood there with tears in his own eyes, his usual composure completely shattered. "You saved our son," Michael's mother said, pulling back to look at Eleanor's face. "We never knew your name. The hospital told us it was a nurse named Eleanor, but we were so overwhelmed, and then when Michael recovered, we never followed up. I've thought about you so many times over the years, wondering if you knew that the baby you saved grew up healthy and happy." "I didn't know," Eleanor said. "I left nursing 6 months after that night. I couldn't handle it anymore. Too many losses, too many babies I couldn't save. But I always remembered Michael. He was one of my last victories before I walked away." They sat together for hours, sharing stories. Eleanor told them about that December night in detail, how she'd fought against her colleagues who wanted to stop, how she'd felt Michael's tiny heart start beating again under her hands. She described the weight of him, so small and fragile, and the sound of his first breath after those 8 terrible minutes. Michael's parents told Eleanor about raising Michael, about how they'd always called him their miracle baby. They told her about his childhood, his interests in computers and technology, his career. They told her about his grandmother, about the fire that took her, about the guilt Michael had carried. "That's why he saved you," Michael's mother said softly. "He couldn't save his grandmother. He's been carrying that guilt for 22 years, even though there was nothing he could have done. He was just a child. But when he saw you on that plane in danger, he had a chance to do something." Eleanor looked at Michael with new understanding in her eyes. "We've both been carrying ghosts, haven't we?" Michael nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. The media attention only intensified when Michael's parents confirmed the story. Reporters camped outside the hospital. The video of the rescue was analyzed frame by frame. Documentaries were being proposed. Religious leaders called it proof of divine providence. Scientists talked about statistical probability. Everyone had an opinion about what it all meant. But for Michael and Eleanor, the meaning was simpler and more personal. They'd found each other twice across a lifetime, and both times one had saved the other. When Michael was finally discharged from the hospital a week later, Eleanor was there to see him off. She'd been discharged 2 days earlier, but had come back specifically for this. Richard wheeled her to the hospital entrance where Michael's parents were picking him up. "What happens now?" Michael asked her. "After all this?" Eleanor smiled. "Now we stay in touch, if that's okay with you. I lost track of you once. I don't want to lose you again." "I'd like that," Michael said. "I'd like that a lot." They exchanged phone numbers and email addresses. Richard gave Michael his contact information as well. insisting that Michael call if he ever needed anything. As Michael's parents' car pulled up, Eleanor grabbed his hand one more time. "Thank you," she said, "not just for saving my life, but for giving me a reason to believe in something bigger than random chance." "Thank you for giving me life in the first place," Michael replied. Over the next few months, Michael and Eleanor built a relationship that neither of them had expected. They talked on the phone every week, sometimes more. They met for coffee when Michael visited Miami, where Eleanor lived with Richard and his family. She became the grandmother figure he'd lost, and he became the grandson she'd never had. Eleanor told him stories about her life, about her late husband who'd been a teacher, about her years as a nurse before the job became too much. She told him about her regrets, about the patients she couldn't save, about walking away from nursing when maybe she should have stayed. Michael told her about his work, about his life in Seattle, about the nightmares he used to have about his grandmother. He found that talking to Eleanor helped, that her presence in his life somehow eased the guilt he'd carried for so long. The media attention eventually died down, as media attention always does. News stories took over the news cycle. The plane crash investigation concluded that faulty wiring had caused the fire. The airline settled with passengers. Life moved on. But Michael and Eleanor's connection didn't fade. If anything, it grew stronger. 6 months after the crash, Eleanor called Michael with an idea. She'd been thinking about their story, about all the first responders and medical professionals who save lives every day without ever knowing what happens to those people. Nurses who perform CPR on strangers, paramedics who pull people from car wrecks, firefighters who carry children from burning buildings, doctors who work miracles in emergency rooms. What if we could connect them? Eleanor asked. What if we could track down these people and reunite them with the lives they've saved? Let them see what happened. Let them know their work mattered. Michael was quiet for a moment, then said, "That's a beautiful idea." "I don't know how we'd do it," Eleanor admitted. "I'm an old woman and you have your job. But maybe we could start a foundation," Michael said, the idea taking shape as he spoke. "A nonprofit. We could use our story to raise awareness, get funding. We could hire investigators to track down these cases and coordinate reunions." Eleanor's voice brightened. "Do you really think it could work?" "I think it's worth trying," Michael said. "In fact, I think it's exactly what we're supposed to do with what happened to us." They called it the Full Circle Foundation. Michael used his software skills to build a website and database. Eleanor used her medical connections to spread the word through hospitals and emergency services. Richard provided legal and financial advice. Michael's parents helped with fundraising. The response was overwhelming. Within weeks, they had their first case, a firefighter who'd pulled a teenager from a house fire 15 years earlier. The teenager was now a paramedic himself, inspired by the man who'd saved him. The reunion made local news and brought in more donations. Then came a paramedic who wanted to meet the car accident victim she'd saved, who'd gone on to become a trauma surgeon. A lifeguard who'd performed CPR on a drowning child, who'd grown up to become a swimming instructor teaching water safety. A police officer who'd talked someone down from a bridge, who'd later become a suicide prevention counselor. Each reunion was different, but they all had the same emotional core. The knowledge that what we do matters, that our actions ripple forward through time in ways we can never predict. Michael threw himself into the foundation work with an energy that surprised him. He'd always loved his software engineering job, but this felt different. This felt like purpose. He started working part-time at his company so he could dedicate more hours to the foundation. Eleanor, despite her age and health challenges, was the foundation's heart and soul. She attended every reunion she could, and when she couldn't be there in person, she video called in. She wrote personal letters to every first responder they connected with, thanking them for their service and telling them how much their work mattered. The foundation grew beyond anything they'd imagined. What started as a small operation in Michael's apartment became a registered nonprofit with an office, staff, and volunteers. They reunited dozens of people in the first year alone. 2 years after the plane crash, Michael stood in a hotel ballroom in Seattle, looking out at a crowd of over 300 people. The Full Circle Foundation's second annual gala was about to begin, and he could hardly believe how far they'd come. The room was filled with first responders in their dress uniforms, medical professionals, and the people whose lives they'd saved. There were firefighters and the families they'd rescued, paramedics and accident survivors, nurses and former patients, teachers and students. Each pair represented a connection that had been lost to time and circumstance, now restored. Eleanor was supposed to give the opening speech, but at 77 years old and with declining health, she'd asked Michael to do it instead. She sat in the front row in her wheelchair, Richard beside her, looking proud and a little tired. Michael adjusted the microphone and began to speak. 3 years ago, I got on a plane heading to Miami for a vacation I desperately needed. I was burned out, exhausted, and honestly a little lost. I had a good job and a comfortable life, but I wasn't sure what any of it meant. I didn't know what my purpose was. He paused, looking down at Eleanor. Then the plane caught fire and everything changed. I met an elderly woman who needed help and I helped her. At the time I thought I was just doing what anyone should do. I thought maybe I was making up for past failures, for times when I couldn't help people I loved. But it turned out to be so much more than that. Michael told the story he'd told dozens of times now, but it never got old. The audience listened, rapt, even though many of them already knew it. The story of how Eleanor had saved his life as a baby, how he'd saved hers decades later without knowing who she was, how they'd found each other twice across the years. The thing is, Michael continued, our story isn't unique. It's happening all the time, all around us. Every day people save lives, perform small and large acts of courage, and then move on without ever knowing what happened next. They don't get to see the child they rescued grow up, graduate college, start a family. They don't know that the teenager they pulled from a car wreck became a doctor. They don't know that their courage inspired someone else's courage, creating a chain reaction of goodness that spreads far beyond what they could imagine. He gestured to the crowd. Everyone in this room is part of that chain. You're living proof that what we do matters, that our actions echo forward through time. The Full Circle Foundation exists to make those echoes visible, to connect the dots that life usually keeps hidden. The speech went on for another 10 minutes, but the part Michael would remember most came at the end, when Eleanor surprised everyone by standing up from her wheelchair. Richard tried to stop her, concerned, but she waved him off with that determined look Michael had come to know well. She walked slowly to the stage, and Michael helped her up the stairs. When she reached the microphone, the crowd rose to their feet, applauding. She had to wait a full minute before they quieted down enough for her to speak. I'm going to keep this short, Eleanor said, her voice still strong, despite her age, because my son is giving me the look that says I should be sitting down. Laughter rippled through the crowd. I spent 40 years wondering if the work I did as a nurse mattered. I saved lives, yes, but I also lost many. I walked away from nursing because the losses became too heavy, because I started to doubt if I was making any real difference. I carried that doubt, that regret for decades. Her voice cracked, but she pushed forward. Then a plane caught fire, and a young man I didn't recognize risked his life to save mine. And I learned that the baby I'd saved all those years ago had grown into this brave, kind man. I learned that my 8 minutes of refusing to give up had given the world Michael Chen, and through him this foundation that has reunited hundreds of people. She turned to look at Michael, tears streaming down her face. You asked me once what happens now, after all this, and I think the answer is that we keep going. We keep connecting people. We keep reminding the world that courage matters, that compassion matters, that every life saved is a universe preserved. We keep the circle going. The applause was thunderous. Over the next year, the foundation flourished. They reunited a Vietnam medic with the soldier he'd saved, both now in their 70s. They found a kindergarten teacher who'd performed the Heimlich maneuver on a choking child 20 years earlier, a child who was now a nurse with 3 kids of her own. They connected a stranger who'd donated bone marrow with the leukemia survivor she'd never met, who'd gone on to become an oncology researcher. Each reunion was filmed and shared, spreading the message further. Michael started getting calls from other countries asking how to start similar organizations. The idea was spreading, the circle growing wider, but Eleanor's health was declining. The plane crash had taken more out of her than anyone realized at the time. Her heart was weakening. She spent more time in bed, more time in doctors' offices. Richard tried to convince her to step back from the foundation to rest, but she refused. This is what I was meant to do, she told Michael during one of their weekly calls. I spent 40 years wondering if my work mattered. I'm not going to waste whatever time I have left. On a Tuesday morning in early spring, almost 3 years after the plane crash, Michael's phone rang at 6 in the morning. It was Richard. She's gone, he said simply. Mom passed away in her sleep last night. Peacefully, she wasn't in pain. Michael felt the world tilt. He'd known this was coming, had seen Eleanor getting weaker, but knowing didn't make it hurt less. He sat on the edge of his bed and cried, grieving the woman who'd saved his life twice, once with her hands and once with her presence. Eleanor had left detailed instructions for her funeral. She wanted it to be a celebration, not a mourning. She wanted the Full Circle Foundation to coordinate it. Most importantly, she wanted Michael to speak. The funeral was held at a church in Miami, packed to capacity. Former patients, nurses she'd worked with, people whose lives the foundation had touched. Michael stood at the podium, looking out at faces wet with tears, and thought about what to say. Eleanor Hartwell saved my life when I was 3 weeks old, he began. She saved it again when I was 34. In between, she saved countless others, some whose names she knew, some she never learned. She spent years thinking she hadn't done enough, hadn't made enough of a difference. He paused, gathering himself. But here's what Eleanor taught me. We never really know the full impact of our actions. That baby she saved became a man who saved her. That rescue inspired a foundation that has reunited hundreds of people. Those reunions have inspired others to act with courage and compassion. The circle keeps expanding, keeps growing, touching lives that Eleanor never met and never will meet. Michael pulled out a piece of paper. Eleanor asked me to read something at her funeral. She wrote it 2 weeks ago when she knew she didn't have much time left. He unfolded the paper, recognizing Eleanor's shaky handwriting. To everyone who comes after me, Michael read, I want you to know that your life is not measured by years or accomplishments or accolades. It's measured by the connections you make, the lives you touch, the courage you show when courage is needed. I thought I was insignificant, but I learned that no one is insignificant. Every action matters. Every kindness echoes. Every life saved is a miracle that ripples forward through time in ways we cannot predict or control. So be brave, be kind, and trust that what you do today will matter decades from now in ways you cannot imagine. The circle is unbroken. Keep it going. Michael folded the paper and looked out at the crowd. Eleanor left a portion of her estate to the Full Circle Foundation, he said. Enough to fund it for at least the next decade. She wanted to make sure the work continues, that more people find their connections, that the circle keeps growing. He looked down at her casket, covered in white flowers. Thank you, Eleanor, for saving me, for teaching me, for showing me what it means to live a life that matters. I promise the circle will keep going. After the funeral, Michael worked with a local monument company to create Eleanor's headstone. He wanted it to say something meaningful, something that captured the essence of their story. He thought about it for weeks before finally settling on the words. When the stone was installed 3 months later, Michael visited the cemetery and stood before it. The inscription read, Eleanor Hartwell, nurse, mother, friend. She saved a life at the beginning of her story and was saved at the end. The circle is complete, but Michael knew the circle wasn't complete. It was ongoing, ever expanding. The Full Circle Foundation continued to grow. In Eleanor's memory, Michael dedicated himself fully to the work, eventually leaving his software engineering job to become the foundation's full-time director. 5 years after Eleanor's death, the foundation had reunited over 1,000 people. They'd expanded internationally. They'd inspired similar organizations in 6 countries. The story of Michael and Eleanor had become a legend of sorts, told and retold, inspiring acts of courage and compassion around the world. Michael, now 39 years old, sometimes thought about that day on the plane. He thought about how he'd almost not helped Eleanor with her bag, how he'd almost looked away when the fire started, how one small choice to help a stranger had changed the entire trajectory of his life. He thought about the invisible threads that connect us all, the ways our lives intersect without us knowing it. He thought about his grandmother, and how maybe in some way saving Eleanor had brought him peace about that old grief. But mostly, he thought about Eleanor's words. The circle is unbroken. Keep it going, and so he did. Every reunion the foundation facilitated, every first responder they connected with the life they'd saved, every story they shared, Michael felt Eleanor's presence. She was there in the tears of joy when people met after years apart. She was there in the gratitude of firefighters who finally knew their work had mattered. She was there in every heart that started beating again, every breath that resumed after CPR, every life that continued because someone refused to give up. The circle wasn't complete. It would never be complete. It would keep growing, keep expanding, touching lives neither Michael nor Eleanor would ever know about. And that, Michael realized, was exactly how it should be. On the 10th anniversary of the plane crash, Michael stood in the same Seattle hotel ballroom where Eleanor had given her last public speech. The gala had grown to over 800 attendees. The foundation had reunited more than 3,000 people. Michael looked out at the crowd and saw the future. Young people inspired to become first responders, families grateful for second chances, strangers who'd become friends through shared experience. He saw the circle Eleanor had started still spinning, still growing, still changing lives. He touched the small photograph in his pocket, the one he always carried. It showed him and Eleanor together, taken at that first gala 3 years after the crash. They were smiling, their arms around each other, looking like the grandmother and grandson they'd become to each other. "We did it," Michael whispered. "The circle keeps going, and somewhere—"
He liked to think Eleanor was smiling too.
Finally at peace with the knowledge that her 8 minutes of refusing to give up had changed the world in ways she'd never imagined possible. Every life she'd saved had saved others in turn. Every moment of courage had inspired more courage. Every connection had led to more connections. The circle was unbroken, and it would keep going long after everyone in that room was gone, rippling forward through time like light through the universe, endless and eternal and beautiful.